A lot going on in our economy. It looks like the inflation, which appears to be mostly caused by corporate price gouging. We have multiple, actually, members of Congress suggesting that it's 54% of total U.S. inflation is corporate price gouging. And the rest of it is the price of oil that the Saudi Arabia and Russia, with Russia's brutal attack on Ukraine, are driving up the price of oil. So today, Jay Powell, the lifelong Republican, former bankster, head of the Fed, is expected to raise interest rates. And, nobody's really talking about what we should do about the price of oil. Professor Richard Wolff is on the line with us, the economist, the co-founder of democracyatwork.info, the author of numerous books. The Sickness is a System: When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself is his most recent, also available as an ebook. And he's also the host of Economic Update with Professor Richard Wolff right here on Free Speech TV. Professor Wolff, I'm curious your thoughts on what might happen in today's Fed meeting and what its impact will be. And then B, has the time for nationalization of oil and gas arrived? And you might want to describe what that is and what that might mean.
Okay, sure. The guessing game on the Federal Reserve action today is really only whether it'll raise interest rates half a point or 3/4 of a point. Both of those are larger than the traditional movements have ever been. Those have been limited usually to 1/4 of a point. It's a sign that the inflation is still with us, big time. It's just as likely to get worse in the next few months as to get better or stay the same. The Federal Reserve is committed now to fighting it. I want to remind everyone the Federal Reserve is supposed to prevent inflations. It failed to do that. It's supposed to fix them when they occur. It so far failed to do that. So now it's taking the next step. But anyone who believes that they have this situation under control must not have been paying attention over the many, many occasions when they haven't, number one. Number two, absolutely the question of nationalization always is on the agenda. Why? All that nationalization means is that the government takes over the business. There are many different forms of doing that. You can buy shares in the company if you're the government. You can give them a massive loan that puts them in your debt. You can literally take them over and make them a government enterprise. All of those things have been done in the past. All of those things are being done today, and all of those things have been done by the United States government in our past. No one should think it's a path-breaking new idea. It has been squashed in recent decades because of the neoliberal ideology that usually goes back to Thatcher and Reagan, in which everything that the public does is somehow bad and everything that the private sector does is somehow good. But it's the private sector whose decisions about whether or not to invest in fossil fuels, whether or not to increase production, and so on. That's led us to the situation we're in now. I know it's convenient to blame the war in Ukraine. There's always something else going on that you can point the finger to. But the bottom line is, if you leave the energy of a society in the hands of private enterprise, you're going to get decisions that are governed and guided by private profit maximization. That's what they're in the business to do. That's what they focus on doing it. So their decisions are always affected by what's going on in the society, but they are governed by how to maximize the profit. The whole idea of the government coming in is that it would not be governed by that. The job of the government is to make the decisions that are best for the people that they are the government of. All of them, not the subsection that depend on profit, but all of us, those of us who depend on wages or salaries, who are the majority, rather than the minorities whose income comes out of the profit sector of our economy. So the question isn't so much whether to nationalize. I understand that's in the air now, that we're paying wild prices for energy and suffering an inflation in large part because of it. That's why these issues come up. But the real question, what kind of nationalization? And let me just add one point. In the Great Recession of 2008 and 9, the federal government nationalized General Motors. It took a different form, but that's what it was. And the peculiar thing that reminded us of is that the only time people who love capitalism want the government to come in is when something is really going wrong. An industry is failing. That was the case of General Motors. Or in these days, an industry is requiring us to pay prices that literally destroy our economy. What we ought to have is a government called in, but if it's going to be called in and using up taxpayer money, which is what we're talking about, then it ought to have a benefit that comes to it. If General Motors recovers, it has to share some of that recovering with the American people whose taxes got them through the crisis. We never do that. Other countries do it. The government holds a share of the company and picks up dividends, picks up economic recovery, which the government helps to produce. But in our country, covered over with this liberal capitalist ideology, we are asked to bail out our industries, but we're never allowed the government to share in. And you know, if the government shared, then it would use that money and lower our taxes, because it wouldn't have to tax the rest of us, including businesses, to keep going, because it would get part of the recovery that it helped to create. And my fear now is we're going to call in the government, bail out the fossil fuels, because they're terrified that the fossil fuels will become useless once the sanction war with Russia is over, because we have to go to safer fuels to save us from the climate disasters that we're facing. And then the fossil fuel industry will collapse. Then our banking system, which is in up to here lending money to fossil fuels, will collapse. And the government always will be called in to save them. It'll cost a fortune. And Lord knows how we'll pay for it, given the condition of the American economy. Bottom line, this is an enormous mess, and we're not giving it the attention that it needs, because it's going to be a problem that tests the very ability of this economy to survive.
Would one of the ways that our federal government could nationalize the oil industry, or at least parts of it, for example, ExxonMobil, you know, an American-based company, it might be a little more difficult with Royal Dutch Shell or something like that, but
very much more.
Yeah. Would one of the ways that they could do that to be to simply go into the stock market and buy a controlling interest of shares?
Absolutely. That has the way it's been done in the past. You could make an exchange. If these companies need massive amounts of credit or money to invest if they need it, or credit to get through a decline in the price, if that's what happens, you could exchange. They could get access to such money from the government in exchange with providing the government with shares. By the way, that happened back in 2008 and 9. Various financial companies had to give shares to the government. But notice, they gave them non-voting shares, which the government accepted. I mean, to the amazement of those of us watching. Why? Why would you give up control over an entity that was so desperate it turned to you, the government, to bail them out? You did them that service, and now you're not giving them any say whatsoever about the massive amount of taxpayer money you just handed to them. There's no rationale for that unless you have a almost religious belief that the government should only be there to bail out the companies, never have in return any kind of control. Nobody in their right mind does that sort of thing, even in a market economy, except the government, which is why we're only talking about nationalizing oil, because we're suffering by the way that oil is being dealt with in the world. You know, whatever your position on the Ukraine war, it would have been a little smarter had the West and the United States understood that if you go after Russia with sanctions, they're going to want to push back. And very few things they have, they're a much poorer economy than the United States. One of the few things they have is their extraordinary control over the price of oil and gas, because they have so much of it. I mean, that doesn't take rocket science. And you might then have figured, whoa, maybe we ought to work out some other solution to this problem, lest it become, in the realm of inflation and oil and energy, a much bigger problem for the human race than the issues of Ukraine could ever have been.
Okay. Perhaps a solution like stopping the export of oil from the United States so that we, well, in any case.
At least they should have been looked at.
There's a lot of alternatives. Professor Richard Wolff, democracyatwork.info, the website, Prof. Wolff on Twitter. Professor Wolff, thank you for dropping by.